Since Christmas is officially upon us, I thought it could be fun to look into the stories behind some of the most known and most loved Christmas songs of all time. I think hearing the background may help you appreciate some of these songs more, or may help you hate them more. I'm not sure which. Also, last year, around the same time, I released a few shorts kind of talking briefly about the history of some of these, so if some of the stories sound familiar, that might be why. But here is a more in-depth look at the story behind 5 of the biggest Christmas songs of all time.
Jingle bells, jingle all the way.
This is arguably the most famous Christmas song of all time. I mean, every crooner ever has their own version of it, despite the fact that it never mentions Christmas at all and was probably intended to be a Thanksgiving song, or just a general wintertime song, but at a certain point, any song that mentioned snow or winter just kind of became a Christmas song for some reason. The song was written by James Lord Pierpont, and if that last name sounds familiar, it's because his sister Juliet used it as the middle name for her first son, John Pierpont Morgan, who became one of the richest people in the country during the Gilded Age. Anyway, James was born in Boston in 1822, and his father was a minister and an abolitionist, which is important to remember for later. James had a pretty interesting childhood, full of disappointing his father. At age 14, he ran away from his boarding school to work on a whaling ship, and then at age 21, he enlisted in the Navy, which meant he spent almost a decade living on ships, basically. And then in 1849, during the whole gold rush thing, he abandoned his family in Massachusetts to seek his fortune out in California. In 1853, he left his family again to move down to Savannah, Georgia, where he worked as a pianist for his brother's church. It's a little bit unclear when he actually wrote Jingle Bells, which was originally known as One Horse Open Sleigh. It's pretty clear that he based the song off of the annual One Horse Open Sleigh races that happened around Thanksgiving every year in Medford, and some people say that he wrote the song as early as 1850 in Medford, Massachusetts. They say that he wrote it at a boarding house called Simpson's Tavern in Medford, but that story's been disputed since it seems like he was still out in California seeking gold in 1850. And to go along with that, it said that he wrote the song to be performed at his father's Sunday school class on Thanksgiving, but that's also not proven. Other people claim that he wrote it when he was living in Georgia working as a pianist for his brother's church, and that was closer to 1857, which was when he originally published it. In that original publication, the dedication said it was to John P. Ordway, who ran a really popular minstrel troupe. Ordway would occasionally perform songs that James wrote, so it's entirely possible that the first professional performance of Jingle Bells was done in blackface. It's said that James barely paid attention to the song until the Salem Evening News wrote a story about it in 1864, and that's when James kind of admitted to writing it and kind of tried to get his name attached to it. But by that point, his life had taken a kind of strange turn. By that point, James had completely abandoned his father's abolitionist belief and was a full-throated supporter of slavery. So at the start of the Civil War in 1861, he enlisted in the Confederate Army, where he continued to write songs for the Confederates to use, and ended up on opposite sides since his father enlisted in the Union Army. After the war, he became a music teacher in Georgia, and he eventually died in Florida in 1893. His descendants fought really hard to keep his name attached to Jingle Bells as it got more popular and his copyright expired.
I really can't stay cold outside.
This song has come under fire the past few years because of the lyrics involving a man not wanting the party to stop and being kind of pushy about it, but it actually was the original Christmas closing time. The song was written in 1944 by Frank Loesser. Frank would eventually be known for writing the music and lyrics to some of Broadway's biggest shows, like Guys and Dolls and How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, though those both came after he wrote Baby It's Cold Outside. A Time magazine article written in 1949 described Frank as, quote, a Hollywood tin-pan alleyite whose specialty is producing catchy, short-lived jingles about leaky faucets and slow boats to China. Frank never really intended for the song to become popular or even for it to be out in the public. He wrote it in order for him and his wife Lynn Garland, who was a nightclub singer, to sing at a housewarming party as his guests were preparing to leave. The song in recent years has been heavily criticized for the man in it not letting the woman leave his house, so it's kind of ironic that it was originally intended to tell partygoers it was time to get out. People really loved the song at that original party. Lynn even said that the partygoers demanded they play it again and again and again, and word spread in the upper-class party scene of New York City. Lynn Garland recalled in her memoir, quote, "We got invited to all of the best parties for years on the basis of Baby. It was our ticket to caviar and truffles." In 1948, Frank sold the song to MGM, who pretty quickly put it into a musical called Neptune's Daughter, which was released in 1949, and it was originally criticized for having kind of risque lyrics, with one company even banning it for a bit for being too racy, but eventually they let it slide. And originally, the biggest controversy about this song was whether or not it was actually a Christmas song. Like Jingle Bells, it never mentions Christmas, and it's just about cold, really. But it's become closely associated with Christmas and the holiday season because, again, anything that mentions snow, I guess, is a Christmas song. In the wake of the Me Too movement, and even a little bit before that, people started to push back against the song because it was seen as kind of predatory and creepy. Especially the line, "What's in that drink?" which people thought was a reference to the male part in the duet, which was known as the wolf spiking the drink or something. It's pretty clear, at least to me, that that line is in reference to alcohol, and one former teacher and jazz enthusiast even said it was a reference to a pretty common joke at the time, writing, quote, "The punchline was invariably that there's actually pretty much nothing in the drink, not even a significant amount of alcohol." So the song is essentially implying that the female part of the duet, the mouse portion, was trying to find some sort of excuse to stay. Personally, I think the song sounds really strange in modern context. I mean, assuming that a woman actually means yes when she is saying no is completely unacceptable, and it's good that we're talking about that more now. I also think it's important to place the song within its historical context, where this kind of like push and pull back and forth was just a part of flirting in 1940s America. Susan, Frank, and Lynn's daughter kind of was confused by the pushback on this song. She said, quote, "The Me Too movement, which I approve of, has really overstepped in this. You have to look at things in cultural and historical context." Judith Smith, who was a professor of American Studies, said, quote, "It's alluding to both men's and women's sexual desire in a playful way, but it seems to me there isn't really any issue about consent." I think Lydia Liza, who's a singer-songwriter who is probably best known for creating and posting an often mocked remake of this song called "Baby I'm Cool With That," I think she summed it up kind of best when she said, quote, "I think as we move forward, things totally transform, and we can put names to those feelings," end quote. I don't think the song was written in the way that some people hear it today. I think it's pretty clear that it was intended to be this playful back and forth between two flirtatious people wanting to express their sexuality during a time where that was not as open and not able to be talked about. But it's also fair to say that some of the lyrics and just the overall tone of the song don't fit in today's society. Societies and cultures change and evolve, and it's totally fine to say that something that fit really well in 1944 America no longer fits in 2024 America. So while it's important to place art and song and music inside its historical context, it's also important to note that not everything has to always and forever be seen within the context that it was first written. Our reaction to things change as our societies change. So it's fine for us to have a different reaction to a song now than we would have had back in 1944. That's totally fine. That's totally normal. So listen to the song or don't. I don't think it really matters all that much.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire.
This song was always my dad's favorite Christmas song, so I grew up hearing it several times at Christmas. Not that I'm really complaining, it's a great song. At least according to BMI, it's the most played Christmas song of all time. But the song actually kind of has an interesting story behind it. It was the summer of 1945, and it was a really hot one. Mel Torme, who is a jazz musician and composer, and who is also incredibly known as the Velvet Fog, headed over to the house of someone he frequently wrote songs with, Bob Wells. Bob was a writer who started out writing songs before transitioning into television and movies. He and Mel had a long history of working together and would continue to do so after this song. Anyway, on that hot day, Mel went to Bob's house. Bob wasn't around, but Mel saw some lines that Bob had written on his desk. Those lines were chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose, Yuletide carols being sung by a choir, and folks dressed up like Eskimos. Mel was really interested in what those lines meant. He didn't quite get the picture, together, and according to Mel's son James, whenever Bob came back into the room and saw Mel there, he said, quote, "Mel, I have tried everything to cool down. I've been in my pool, I had a cold drink, I've taken a cold shower, I'm nothing but hot. And I thought that maybe, if I could just write down a few lines of wintry verse, I could psychologically get an edge over this heat." So Bob had no idea that he was writing a song when he jotted down those lines. He was just trying to trick his brain into thinking that it was colder than it actually was. But Mel convinced Bob that he thought there was something to those words that he had written down, and 45 minutes later, they had the Christmas song. They originally took it to a publishing house who rejected it because they thought that no one would want to put out a song that was really only marketable once a year. Secular Christmas music hadn't become much of a thing yet. White Christmas was released in 1942 and was a smash hit. It kind of introduced the world to this idea that secular Christmas music had a market, but no one else had been able to capitalize on that to the same extent as White Christmas. Labels, musicians weren't ready to take that chance yet. So Mel and Bob took the song to the house of Nat King Cole and played it for him. He immediately told them to play it again, and before they had finished the second time through, he stopped them and said, "That's my song, I have to have it." At that time, Nat was getting really popular, so Bob and Mel just kind of let him have it, and the rest is history. Bob and Mel ended up writing about 150 songs together, but none of them would repeat the success of the Christmas song. I figured it might be kind of fun to stop with the more modern stuff. I mean, 1940s is not modern, but you know what I mean, and focus on a much older song that's probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous Christmas songs of all time. It was in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars in 1818, after a lot of chaos and destruction, when a young Austrian assistant priest named Joseph Mohr attended a performance. A group of actors were traveling through the Austrian Alps, performing a dramatized version of the Christmas story from the biblical gospel accounts. When they got to Joseph's village, they had to do their performance in a person's home because the organ was broken at the church. Joseph was so moved by what he had seen that he decided to take a longer route home so that he could walk and just think about the story he had just seen. That route took him to the top of a hill that overlooked Oberndorf, which was his small village. He stood there looking out at the silent, empty, snow-covered village, thinking about the story that he had just seen, and that's when he remembered a poem that he wrote a few years back that was about the angels announcing the birth of Jesus to the shepherds. You can find that story in the Gospel of Luke. He thought that poem would make a really good carol for his church to sing. So he went to the church organist, a guy named Franz Gruber, to see about creating a melody so they could sing the carol on Christmas Eve the next night. Since the organ was broken, Franz created a simple melody that could be played on guitar, and the two of them performed Silent Night the next day during the Christmas Eve service. A few weeks later, the church finally had his organ repaired by a guy named Karl Maracher, and Karl told Franz to test out the repaired organ by just playing the keys, and Franz sat down and he played out the simple melody to Silent Night, and Karl was immediately intrigued. Karl loved the song, so he took copies of the music and words back to his small village. It was from Karl's small village that two traveling folk groups first heard the song and started spreading it all over the world. The Strasser sisters spread it around Northern Europe, even performing it for the King of Prussia in 1834, who loved the song so much that he had his cathedral choir sing it every Christmas Eve. Then in 1839, the Rainier family of singers took the song to the USA, where they performed it in the original German in front of Trinity Church in New York City. 45 years after Joseph first took that walk one snowy December 23rd, his song was translated into English, and now his poem is sung around the world in over 300 different languages. Joseph himself only spent one more year in that small village that inspired the song. He was moved around a few different times to different villages who needed his services. He was an incredibly generous guy. He donated most of his salary to people in need, and whenever he landed at his final place that he served as a pastor, he made sure to set up a fund to help poor children receive an education and to care for the elderly. In 1848, at the age of 55, he passed away from respiratory disease, and the village where he died, the school is still named after him. It's not really Christmas until someone defrosts Mariah Carey so she can belt this song for us again. This song tops the charts like every year and is apparently the most downloaded Christmas song of all time. It's a festive, quirky, romantic song, but the story behind it wasn't all that happy. Mariah wrote the song with her longtime collaborator Walter Afanasieff, and the idea to do a Christmas album actually came from Mariah's new husband, Tommy Mottola, who was the head of Sony Music. Mariah and Walter initially didn't want to do it, since Christmas albums were kind of for artists on the decline at that time, which wasn't Mariah in the early 90s. Finally, Tommy wore them down, and Mariah and Walter started working on a Christmas album. All I Want for Christmas wasn't the first song they wrote. As Walter remembered, quote, "The first song we wrote was Miss You Most at Christmas Time. It was a ballady sort of sad song, and then we wrote a classical sort of religious song called Jesus Born on This Day." But Mariah and Tommy wanted something poppier and brighter, more of a 60s sound, heavily inspired by what Phil Spector did with his incredible album A Christmas Gift for You. Walter just started playing a melody on the piano, and Mariah sang the first line, and it was just off from there. But Walter initially pushed back on the vocal melody that Mariah came up with, saying it sounded kind of like a vocalist doing a warm-up scale. Walter said that it was an incredibly easy song to write compared to the other ones that they had written together, and they were done with it in about 15 minutes. Even though he understood the mass appeal, especially after hearing Mariah's recorded vocals, Walter never really loved the song. But despite the poppier 60s feel and the hopeful quality of the song, things were a little dark in Mariah's personal life. Mariah has said that her marriage to Tommy wasn't great at all, and that he essentially kept her locked away and would track her every movement on video cameras that he set up. In her memoir, Mariah wrote about how she used songs like All I Want for Christmas to escape, to pretend to be someone happy. She wrote, quote, "I created the fun and free girl in my videos so that I could watch a version of myself be alive, live vicariously through her, the girl I pretended to be, the girl I wished was me." Walter and Mariah did eventually stop working together after Mariah's 1997 album, but they'll always have this song, and presumably live very comfortably off the royalties from it for years to come. So, that's the story of 5 of the biggest Christmas songs ever recorded. Hopefully you know a little bit more about their history, and that helps you appreciate them a little bit more this season. Let me know of any other interesting Christmas song stories in the comments below. Leave this video a like if you ended up enjoying it, and subscribe so you don't miss more stories from music history.